This class is concerned with decision making and stakeholders. Let's start by talking about stakeholders. A stakeholder can be an individual or a group who has an interest or an involvement in an organization. So we can identify who the stakeholders are just from that statement. The employees of the company, they have an interest in the organization, so they are stakeholders. The suppliers are stakeholders, the suppliers of raw materials and of equipment. The customers are stakeholders because they have an interest in the organization because it supplies goods and services that they require. Organizations must consider all stakeholders when it concerns when it comes to decision making, when it concerns decision making. So stakeholders must be taken into account at a time of decision making. Decisions ultimately affect the stakeholders. Whatever the decision the company comes to, it will impact on some stakeholders, if not all. So they must be taken into account when devising decisions, when coming to a decision. Now, stakeholders can be internal, they can be connected, or they could be external. And we'll look at the differences between these in the next slide. First of all, let's look at internal and external stakeholders. Well, we see here for a start that the internal are within the, let's say, within the company. The connected are related to the company, and then we have a wider set of stakeholders who are perhaps not connected directly to the company, but who would be affected by the company. Simple example just to clarify this point. Internal could be the employees of the company. Connected could be the suppliers of raw materials, the suppliers of machinery, the people who supply services to the company, perhaps an accountancy firm or a marketing agency. These will be connected stakeholders. And the external ones could be the local community, who don't work directly for the company, but who would be affected if the company, let's say, was to close down. If the company ceased business, then the local economy would be affected adversely, and that would affect people who did not work for the company directly. So the external stakeholders could be seen as the community, the society, pressure groups, media, government, professional bodies. These are external. They're external to the company, but they would be affected if the business, let's say, was to close down, was to cease trading. They're not directly linked to the organization, but the organization's decisions do impact on this set of stakeholders. Perhaps local shopkeepers would be affected, local restaurants, local taxi companies. These are external stakeholders. The connected stakeholders are financiers, shareholders, suppliers, distributors, and customers. These are connected to the company. These are linked to the company. So the connected or primary stakeholders have an economic interest or a contractual relationship within the organization. If the company ceases to exist, then the suppliers will be adversely affected. So also will be the shareholders, and perhaps the banks, and the distributors, and so on. So these are connected stakeholders, different to the external. The internal stakeholders are the managers and the employees, the people who work for the business. So The internal stakeholders are directly linked to the organization. Now let's talk about stakeholder engagement. This is a concept used by organizations to involve stakeholders in the decision-making process. It means engaging with the stakeholders, getting their opinions, seeking their advice, getting their responses to various positions, and doing surveys amongst them and asking them directly, perhaps having focus groups to try and work out what the stakeholders think about particular decisions. And techniques such as stakeholder analysis ensure organizations identify stakeholders most affected by the organization's decisions. So a stakeholder analysis will identify who is directly affected and who's affected most by decisions. And then perhaps it's on the organization to ask those stakeholders what they think, what they feel about the decision, or what they would like to see happen. Stakeholders contribute to decision making by suggesting ideas, expressing views and opinions, and offering solutions. They may do this by directly contacting the organization, direct contact, or perhaps a public meeting, or through a focus group, through responding to some questionnaire, public meetings, as I said. So the stakeholders can contribute to decision making by making their views felt about certain situations. So stakeholders are important in that sense. So stakeholder engagement takes place perhaps through focus groups or meetings, as I said. Could be through surveys and questionnaires. It could be where communities and partnerships get involved with the organization. The local community may have some conduit, some contact with the organization, and ask the organization to do or not do certain things. So there is a channel of communication open between the local community and the business. Now, stakeholder analysis. Well, this is a technique used to identify key stakeholders who have an interest in a particular decision-making process. So when a decision is going to be made, perhaps a decision to close down a department or expand a different department, or some decision that's perhaps going to have an impact, a wide impact on the community, on the employees, on the shareholders, on profitability, perhaps it's quite a risky decision. When this decision is about to be made, the key stakeholders, the ones most affected, need to be identified and consulted, spoken to, their opinions sought, their worries perhaps discussed openly, and some solutions found to address the worries. A stakeholder analysis is, step one is to prepare a list of relevant stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? And then prioritize the list. Don't just have a list of the stakeholders. Who are most affected by the decision? Prioritize. Make those number one. Who's next most affected? Make those number two. So prioritize the list of stakeholders. And three, develop understanding of key stakeholders. Why do the stakeholders say what they do? Why do they act as they do? What is their interest? What do they want? What's the focus of the stakeholders? And how does it vary from that of the organization? And how can the two be bridged? How can they be resolved? Let's look at number one first. List the relevant stakeholders. So identify the stakeholders whom may be affected by a decision. So simply make a list of who they are. Maybe the employees, the shareholders, parts of the local community, perhaps people who use the roads that will be blocked up by extra traffic, or list out who are the stakeholders, who are going to be affected. They may have to do this by brainstorming possible stakeholders, looking at the internal, the connected and the external stakeholders. Just simply listing out all of the stakeholders that they think are involved, and widening the input on that list to make sure that the list is reasonable and as comprehensive as it can be. Each stakeholder needs to be considered and look at how the decision will impact on that stakeholder. So it's creating a comprehensive list of the stakeholders who will be affected by the decision and trying to work out how the stakeholders are going to be affected by the decision. Now the second step is to prioritize the stakeholder list. The stakeholders are not all the same. Some will be affected a lot, some will be affected very little. So it's important to rank who is going to be affected most by the decision. In other words, prioritize the list. Some stakeholders have the power to influence decisions, whilst others have an interest in the decision taken by the organization. So it's also important to recognize that it's not just the organization affecting the stakeholder, but the stakeholder may also affect the organization. For example, the local community may have political connections, they may have political power, so that planning applications could be referred and held up or refused. So it's important to know the stakeholders and work out who are important and who need to be dealt with. In other words, prioritize the list. So they need to be mapped out in terms of importance. That's the point. So stakeholder mapping could look something like this. You could have the power of the stakeholder on the vertical axis and the interest that needs to be paid to the stakeholder. So if they've got low power and they're not that affected, just keep them under observation. They are stakeholders and they need to be monitored. They need to be watched. They need to be taken into account during decisions. If they've got a lot of power and they're very interested in what's going on, then they need to be managed. They need to be managed appropriately. This means they need to be contacted, and it needs to be done in a sensitive way, a way that will enable the business to carry out its policy, to make its decision, but at the same time address the issues of the stakeholders. And step 3, develop understanding of key stakeholders. It's important to understand the issues that the stakeholders are raising. It's important to understand the stakeholders themselves and get information about the stakeholders. And why are they so concerned? Why have they got an issue? Is there something deeper that needs to be considered? Is there a further explanation that goes even further back that needs to be addressed? Identify the stakeholders and then look at to try and understand the stakeholders and deal with what their issues are so that the decision can be implemented effectively. So identify the stakeholders, prioritize them, and then try to understand